recording. We will be recording the video, and the link will be available shortly to attendees from this evening. And at this point, I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Weiss. Jonathan Weiss is a PhD clinical psychologist, an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at York University. And he has done pre-doctoral internship at Surrey Place Center in Toronto, and the dual diagnosis program at CAMH in Toronto, and a research fellow in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Toronto. And I'm going to let him introduce the work that he does, the things that it is that he likes to focus on, and I'll pass it right over to you, Dr. Weiss.
Thanks, Laura, and thanks everybody for joining me this evening. And thanks for the invitation for coming to present to this group. I believe you had a presentation from my mentor, colleague, and friend, Dr. Yona Lunsky, who just before, who I did my work with at CAMH. So you might notice a similarity in terms of our style or in terms of some of the things we're interested in, because we share, I think, similar aspirations and research interests. My research interest is in supporting the mental health of people with developmental disabilities across the lifespan. I focus most of my work on children and adolescents and emerging adults with intellectual disability, with autism, with ADHD, those neurodevelopmental conditions. Mostly recently has been around working with people with intellectual disability or autism in that school age or high school age kind of world. But my interest is really focused on the mental health side of things, on understanding the kind of interventions and supports that are effective to promoting good mental health, on understanding how we can support families in terms of family wellness and optimize systems of care more broadly, community organizations, recreation and leisure and sport programs. I've got a particular interest, as you'll hear tonight, in studying how we can improve sport programs like Special Olympics, all with the idea that it's not about rectifying or addressing or getting rid of a person's developmental difference, but about trying to help them live their best life, trying to their best possible self, that everybody deserves mental health. Said another way, everybody deserves to have the same opportunity for mental health or mental health problems, regardless of whether a person has an intellectual disability or not. And the fact is that many people, Laura and I were just talking before this, that it's very typical, especially during COVID, that people are struggling more than ever, but it doesn't mean, that people with intellectual disabilities should be struggling more, right? And I think I'm striving for, through my research, to affect kind of equity in that sense. But today I want to have a bit of a positive switch. I want to share with you some work that I'm doing, some ideas that I have, and what we're finding around flipping the script on what it means to study mental health and developmental disability. What we're really interested in now at York and my research lab is about understanding what flourishing looks like in people with intellectual disabilities or people with autism. And it can look different at different ages, as you'll find. So I'll share with you some of that research. It's what we're calling a best life. So what does that really look like? A big kind of part of this research is that traditionally, research has focused on very negative constructs, very negative topics when it comes to developmental disabilities. Anxiety and mental health, anxiety disorder, stress, depression, psychosis, morbidity. These are all critical things to focus on if we're going to address problems when they arise, or even prevent them from arising altogether. But if we only focus on that negative, then we're missing an important part of what it means to live well. And so what I'm striving for in my work is to find a balance in terms of what we mean by mental health and how we can promote it. In fact, I think we would all agree that everybody deserves to thrive. But what does that look like for somebody with Down syndrome, for a young person with Down syndrome? What does it look like for a family member who is supporting a person with Down syndrome? We could assume that thriving looks the same regardless of if somebody has a disability or not. But I prefer not to assume. We want to do some work to actually capture and appreciate the uniqueness in the nuances that comes with difference. So this is informed by a broader field of literature on what we call positive youth development. But most of the time, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are left out of the conversation, the discourse on positive youth development. Right? It seems to be primarily about reducing problems that people have, and again, very important. But with general, when we're talking about trying to promote development in young people in general, we talk about those problems, but we also talk about ways to promote healthy development. So what does this look like, and how can we promote that? And I'll present some research on this, and especially research that highlights for me how the answer to the question of how we can promote thriving and how we can help people with Down syndrome or people with other intellectual disabilities thrive and flourish in life is to focus on finding the ingredients in their contexts, in their environments, in their social milieu that we can address. It's not just about addressing the person. So you'll get that flavor from me tonight of this individual context kind of interaction. But I am a psychologist, and I often joke that if I don't start my slide with some type of percentage, they take my license away. So here's one of the first the percentages to talk about. You know, typically pre-COVID, about 40% of young people with intellectual disability are experiencing a mental health crisis or a significant mental health problem at any one moment in time. And that rate's higher than in the general population. You know, about 1 in 5 or 20%. A study that I was involved in with Yona Linsky, who spoke here a few nights ago, looked at rates of psychiatric diagnoses in young people 18 to 24 years of age in Ontario across the province using OHIP information, kind of the Medicaid information when you swipe your health card. And so we were able to look who has a developmental disability, who has autism or autism on their file, and who doesn't have any developmental disability. And so we were able to compare about 5,000 young people with autism or with a diagnosis of autism on their file to about 10,000, a bit over 10,000 young people with other developmental disabilities, including Down syndrome, and compared that to a randomly selected group of young adults in Ontario who don't have any developmental disability. And what you can see in this graph is that about 40%, so 38% of young people with developmental disabilities and 51% of young people with identification of autism in the last 2 years in their OHIP file, in their Medicare file, in their medical file, in the last 2 years had a query or a diagnosis of some mental health condition. So it's much higher than the about 20% in the general population. So the take-home message is that people with developmental disabilities are certainly at and this is pre-COVID, at higher risk. But mental health is also a conversation that we have to have for all people and all young people. And it's not just about, do you have a diagnosis or don't you? Because a lot of people struggle with social and emotional difficulties, and they might not meet the criteria, but they still deserve support. So there's a lot of research documenting these troubles, and the take-home message is that we can't negate this if we want people to have a good life and to live well. But if I spent the entire hour with you now talking about that, right, and that's the only message that we had around mental health, then all you would see would be nails, right? That would be the entirety of what we're talking about here. But the absence of mental health problems is not the same thing as good mental health. And I argue that we want to achieve truly positive outcomes. We need to have positive constructs or positive language. So if I were to ask you, this is all hypothetical, so you have to think about this for yourself. But if I were to ask you to describe how mentally healthy you are, what words would you use? I would venture that some of you would use words like calm or confident or anxious, sad or stressed, fulfilled, the list goes on and on, satisfied, right? So it's not always about just anxiety or depression. And if I asked you about what successful living meant to you, you wouldn't probably talk about it as symptom reduction. That is, you probably wouldn't say successful living to me means having a reduction of anxiety symptoms from having 7 anxiety symptoms to 4, right? Or a T-score, a certain like severity level on this scale going down a few points. While important, successful living, I think we all know, there's a lot more to it than that. So my research is very much focused on trying to capture that for people with developmental disabilities. So thinking of the positive, this is an active process. In developmental disabilities, as I mentioned, a lot of it has been very deficit focused, and that's important, but how much research is going on to document what happiness looks like? What, beyond things like psychological suffering, what does true life satisfaction look like? We know that these things are important, not just in their own right, but also because when people start to experience greater happiness, greater thriving, these what we call positive psychology constructs, they also demonstrate greater problem solving, learning potential, have better health, and live longer. So this, if we can address these factors, we can actually boost people's outcomes in other ways, right? And so this is really important for measurement and also for treatment planning. Having a program that boosts somebody's happiness is going to look different than having a program that reduces their anxiety. So what do I mean by thriving? Hopefully you've already been imagining what that means to you. Here's a technical definition of thriving that I like, one of many. An individual's pursuing a life path on which individually or functionally valued behaviors grow and move the person towards the attainment of an idealized personhood characterized by socially or structurally valued behaviors such as contributions. Now, let me break that down. There's a lot into this sentence, which I have to take a breath. So thriving is not an outcome. It's not like you've thrived, check. Thriving is a pursuit. It's a process. It's a process where what we do, our behaviors, our actions, that they develop and they build off of each other. They become more complex, they grow. And those actions that are important are ones that are valuable to the person, or they're valuable because the person might not even know that they're valuable, but they're valuable because they help achieve things that are important, right? So you can have, somebody could have a significant disability and not be able to reflect on all of the great things that they do that help them kind of in life and help them grow in life, but they still do those things. And what's important is that these behaviors, these actions move people towards an idealized version of themselves. And that doesn't mean that a person ever has to achieve that. And it doesn't even mean that that person has to know what that looks like. It's almost like deep down, we have a compass, we have a sense of growth, of where we can go, right? And that needs to be nurtured. And if we have a lot of negative experiences and trauma and so on, that can impact that compass, that direction. But within all of us, within every single person, there is this goal in mind. And if we provide the right kind of ingredients, we move towards it, right? And that goal is something that sometimes is valued by society, or it's valued because it just helps. It's good for the person, it's good for their family, it's good for their community. So that's kind of a piece of what we can break down. And what I like about this definition is that it applies, I believe, to everyone. It applies to young people. It applies to, well, it's been often talked about in terms of youth. I think it applies equally to adults. It applies to people with intellectual disability. It applies to people without intellectual disability. So we've done some research trying to capture this. And let me share with you the way that we do that. And this will be a bit of a thought experiment at the same time. So how would you agree with the following statements? I'm going to assume that you have a family member with Down syndrome being a part of this talk. So in thinking about that family member, maybe it's in this case with the italicized language here, it's talking about your child, but maybe you're talking about your brother or your sister. But there are 6 essentially aspects that you can operationalize thriving under, and we found them to be pretty relevant. So you can think about this. How would you agree with the following statements? My child has the skills to succeed in school or work, in social situations with friends and adults, in play, and at home. My child knows how to behave and does what's needed to do well. That's a question that's grouped together, a bunch of statements, but overall, how would you say, I disagree with that, or I'm not sure, or I agree, or I strongly agree with that? Another one is confidence. My child believes that they can succeed and do what's needed to do well in the family, in school, in social situations, with friends, with adults, in play. So it's almost like the competence one, but the belief in themselves. Connectedness is the third C, and you see all these are all C's. So there's 6 C's of thriving that we often measure. Competence, confidence, the third one being connectedness. Connectedness is my child has positive relationships with their parents or siblings or other family members, with friends, teachers, coaches, mentors, etc. So those positive relationships, do they have them? Would you disagree with that statement about your child? Would you agree with it? Would you strongly agree with it? The other 3 are caring, character, and contribution. Caring, my child cares about other people. They're concerned about whether others have what they need. So that's kind of showing sympathy. They show sympathy, and they show a sense of compassion or empathy. My child's both sympathetic and empathetic to others. Do they show that kind of caring? Character, my child knows what's right and wrong and does the right thing. My child's open to others' perspectives and believes in justice for all. My child's honest. Now, in using these kinds of questions before, a lot of times family members or a person might say, well, so this depends, or some of that applies and some of it doesn't. Or I would disagree. So the reason I asked the authors who developed these questions, Richard Lerner and and his colleagues, and one of the responses was, it is hard to wrestle with having this all in the same sentence or the same kind of section. But the idea there is that it forces us not to break down into itemized bits, but instead to consider as a whole, making a forced judgment, taking all of these things into account. Some of our work actually right now going forward is to figure out, can we measure this better? But this is something we've already used, and I want to share with you the findings after you're thinking about how much you would agree with these statements. And the last one is contribution, which is that kind of that outcome of thriving, the contribution to a person's self or others. Does your child try to do things to help the family, to help neighbors, to help the community? Do they try to help themselves by doing things like staying healthy? So how would you answer? What percentage of people here would agree to these kinds of statements? What percentage of people, of caregivers of people with intellectual disabilities would agree with statements like this? Right? Would people all say this doesn't apply, or would everybody agree? Well, in some of the work we've done already, many parents, when faced with those kind of questions, many parents of people with intellectual disability do agree with those statements. And I hope that many people here agreed with some of those statements. It's not 100%. We did a large study with Special Olympics a number of years ago. And these weren't kind of elite athletes who were going to international games. We're talking about kind of Special Olympians, athletes, young athletes across the province, who were affiliated with their local levels. They went to bowling, they went to track and field, they swam, they did that in their own communities. And, we had participants who had autism, participants with intellectual disability without autism, but everybody had intellectual disability in the sample. And you can see here kind of the rates that about half of the sample kind of said, yeah, my child has that competence. About 60% said, yeah, I agree or strongly agree with confidence. Almost 90% strongly agreed with connectedness to others. Similarly, very high rates around showing caring for others, character, and contribution. Does it mean that everybody experiences that? No, in terms of what their, at least the parents' opinion. And part of our research is really trying to answer the question, how can we increase those bars? How can we get that to 100%? We might never reach that 100%, but we aspire to move people towards that. What conditions, what can we do to move them higher up, essentially? I should also add that not everybody's created equal in the sense of experiences, that people with different developmental challenges might struggle differently, and people in different contexts will struggle differently. In this study, what we actually found was that athletes who had both autism and intellectual disability, even though they had similar functional kind of challenges around communication or around being independent as their peers without autism, those who also had autism, um, uh, the fact that they had more social communication difficulties and the fact that they had less opportunities to participate meaningfully at home, at their schools, and in their communities, those differences explained why they actually were thriving or less likely to thrive than their peers. So it wasn't the diagnosis of autism per se, it was the fact that there were more communication challenges in the person, but also that there was less inclusion, that they experienced less inclusion in their contexts. And those differences explained thriving. And this leads me to kind of reflect a bit more on what some of those ingredients are that are really important. In terms of intervening, two areas that we often talk about are how can we boost up a person's individual strengths, and what are those individual strengths that we can target and that we have to target or that we should consider to boost that thriving, and what are what we call the ecological assets. What are the resources in that person's contexts, in their schools or in their workplace, in their family lives, in their community? What's out there outside of them? And how do those two things align? The greater the alignment or the fit between a person's strengths and goals and the assets that are around them, the greater they thrive. And this is kind of the theory behind it. So what are those strengths and what are the assets that we can target and that we can change or increase? Because as we do that, we should see increases in those C's. We already know that when some athletes struggle more with social communication challenges and they struggle with being included in terms of participating in meaningful activities in their contexts, that they thrive less. So there's this correlation there. So I often, when I'm talking to service providers or educators, I often bring this up because I say, we all end up having a role in being able to address mental health if we talk about thriving as part of mental health, because we all have an opportunity to either address aspects of a person's strengths or improve their environments. Doesn't mean it's all on us, but we can all have a role to play. Really interesting study was published a number of years ago that I want to share with you by Eric Carter and colleagues. They did this large study in the US where they asked family members to report on strengths in youth with intellectual disability, around the same ages of the other study I shared with you. And they did this in a number of different ways. They interviewed like hundreds of family members. And they also had a number of different questionnaires kind of completed to try to get this. In their interviews, they then took all that together and they came up with themes of all of the different strengths that people talked about when they said, what are your child's or what is your brother's individual strengths? They put these under 4 or 5 domains that you can see here. The first being interpersonal strengths. And these were some of the sub themes or the top ones are kind of the value, and the ones the ones in black are kind of like the traits, right, that a person might have, like a trait of being compassionate or being social, loving, being good with children, being helpful, accepting of others, of showing leadership, of being loyal, of being polite, of being prayerful, of remembering people. These were the traits, the interpersonal traits that were talked about as strengths. In terms of traits of a person's personality: sweet, happy, dedicated, resilient, sincere, positive, self-determined, humor, being easygoing, self-confident, patient. Now, these things aren't all or nothing, of course. It's not like a person is either happy or not. All of these things are dimensional in the sense that some people will be more easygoing than others. Some people might be more patient than others. And depending on how you're doing, and like a certain part of this is a state, right? We might be happy at some moments and not happy, or less happy certainly at others. But overall, the idea is not to find those things that are immutable or unchangeable. In fact, the idea here is, how can we change these things? How can we, what kind of experiences can we provide to bolster some of these, identify what a person already has and bolster those even more? And that's what we do in positive psychology for people without developmental disabilities. But rarely is this talked about when it comes to Down syndrome or other intellectual disability. That is, rarely do we ask these kinds of questions. Let's do what we call a character assessment, where we kind of identify on a person's kind of trait map. What are their strengths, their character strengths? Let's identify them and let's then boost them. A third domain that they talked about were strengths in cognition, cognitive strengths, intelligence, good memory, creativity, moral discernment, being analytical or a deep thinker, being introspective. And lastly, skills, strengths in discrete tasks. So some parents, I wondered about what do they mean by that? Well, a lot of these are self-evident, but what they mean by discrete tasks is family members talked about how some of the people had very strengths in specific tasks and amazing strengths in those tasks. I'm not talking about savant per se or special that nobody else could do, but just recognizing that people have unique strengths in some of the things that they're doing. It speaks to that alignment. We want to ask people to do things that they have their strengths in. Strengths in athletics, in self-care and caring for animals, or that is being able to actually being able to care for animals, not just caring in the sense of liking animals. And they also had another one, hobbies, which I would put under skills, but they kept it separate, that people had a lot of strengths around the hobbies or their interests. So I really like the way that this is grouped, because it gives us a sense of some of the things we can measure in people, and some of the things we can prize and value and reinforce. And the more we can do that, the more we're kind of building those individual strengths. And we all have different strengths and challenges. So what kind of interventions address these kinds? Well, I think a lot of them are, should be in our communities already. They're not all, I don't want to talk myself out of a job, but the idea isn't that a person should have to go to a clinical psychologist to have these strengths grow. That experiences within the education system, within their communities, within their workplaces, within their access to recreation and leisure, within their friendships and their families. These are the contexts where these things grow and develop, combined with their own traits and who they are as people. There's one quote of a young man that I like to share. He mentioned, if you are in love with something, adore something, are intensely involved or fixated or honed in on one thing, I want to say, don't let anyone take that away, right? This idea of prizing a person's individual goals and what they value, and fostering that and starting at that is a good place. So what are some of the other kind of how do you, all those strengths that I talked about, if we were to bring them together and cluster them a bit more, a number of people talk about what we call self-regulation, and that's not the same thing as regulating our emotions, but self-regulation being able to implicitly set goals for ourselves, or work with others to set goals and identify how we can reach those goals and work towards those goals, even when it's tough. We talked about cognition. Some people might have very specific academic strengths or social strengths, certainly physical strengths, emotional strengths, or spiritual strength. That is, it doesn't mean you have to have all of these, but in thinking about people and thinking about yourself, how would you rate your strengths in these kind of dimensions? And what would you need to grow some of them? Now let me shift over to the ecology side. I told you that a lot of this was going to be more about the social world, the context. And context matters greatly for everybody when it comes to this kind of healthy development or thriving. Probably most important as a summary is a meaningful if I had to summarize things, it would be meaningful participation in relevant areas of a person's life, in areas that are relevant to them. So being able to engage in a way that matters to them and be able to experience that they matter in those areas is a key aspect to flourishing. Beyond the actual participation, another key component or ingredient that we need in our contexts is the opportunity to make choices. It's not that we all have to always engage in these activities. In fact, if you were to force people to meaningfully engage in home and school and their communities all the time, and they didn't have a choice in what they did, it actually would go against the notion of of that outcome. That is, sometimes people, what they really need to flourish is not the actual engagement, but it's being given the opportunity to say no to that engagement. And then at other times being able to say yes to it. Now that some people might need scaffolding or support to do that, right? It doesn't mean saying to everybody, oh, you just decide and then tell me it's all on you, right? We can have discussions and have conversations sometimes with some clients. I'll show you actually in a few slides from now, some examples of how I try to map this out with what's called the F words, not the negative F word, but some other F words. So I'll give you a sense of what that is in a little bit. But there are ways that you can have conversations to get a sense of what are the opportunities and that they'd like to have, and what kind of supports do they need to actualize those kinds of opportunities. People need resources that are aligned with their support needs. It's unfair to present or to create expectations of meaningful participation if we're not also able to bring in those resources to scaffold that. And that's why different opportunities and a menu of different opportunities with different levels of support are needed, so we can find that right balance of helping and allowing for independence at the same time. So some of the things that I often look for is aspects of social inclusion, of personal resources, that is, finances are important. Support in the sense of financial support is really important. So there's a place here for policy. Having access to positive people in a person's life, family, friends, colleagues, acquaintances. Collective activity. While some people might want to do things alone, they might do things alone, and that's perfectly fine. But having a sense that you're doing it alone, but that collectively as a group, there's a number of people doing the same thing, or actually working as a group, is a healthy aspect of development. Experiencing the fact that you're contributing meaningfully to a larger good, to a collection. I mentioned already opportunities, but also positive places, safe places. This is actually, I mean, physically safe and emotionally safe places. And institutional resources. So it's not just about finances, but being able to go to places that have the access to resources here that they can provide, right? That they have what's needed. So this might feel like, hopefully it's not Pollyanna to you, because I've been able to measure a number of these things in our research, and we can actually see differences where some people and some contexts have a greater degree of resources, have greater degree of positive people or places, have more opportunities than others. So there is variability out there. It's as a whole, how do we lift all boats? As an example of this, as I mentioned at the beginning, part of, in terms of my research, I'm very interested. I do a lot of research. I was a coach for many years with Special Olympics before I became a psychologist. And I volunteered with that organization. And then I went on to, part of my research involves doing research with Special Olympics in Canada. This is one kind of example of some research we've done. Well, I'll start off with that piece, and then I'll loop back to what's on the top. So we published a study a number of years ago now, where what we did is this is back when people didn't have smartphones really. People use disposable cameras more than smartphones. And so we did a project where we gave a number of athletes from Special Olympics and their families disposable cameras. And then we had meetings where we actually learned together how to use disposable cameras and what you can't use it for. And then we asked them to go out and to take pictures of what Special Olympics means to them, right? And the number one theme that came up from athletes was connectedness. This was before I was doing any research on thriving or on those C's. And we came up with, okay, that was the number one thing, where pictures, we developed their pictures, and then we reviewed those with athletes, and they sorted them and they picked them. And some athletes had a lot to say. Some athletes didn't use language often and kind of spoke in one or two words, but being able to use the pictures gave them an opportunity to elaborate a bit, to point out parts of the pictures that were important to them, to select the pictures that they liked. And we could actually complement that with what their parents wanted to say. We also gave it to coaches too. So the two major kind of content areas, there's lots under it, but the first one was social connection. That's what Special Olympics means to them, more than the sport. And the second was training and sport. So we got lots of photos of medals and ribbons and bowling balls and so on, but we got way more on, people. What's this photo about? Oh, it's hanging out after practice. It's being silly together. It's tying each other's shoes or tying each other's laces, right? Those were the pictures. It was really more about being around and being truly connected with others, with a team in this case. This kind of experience is even more important when we reflect on the fact that as youth with developmental disabilities get older through our school systems, I mean, this research I'm sharing here comes from the States, but it probably is the same here. The less likely they are to experience acceptance from their peers and reciprocal friendships. So as people with developmental disabilities kind of go through the elementary school year, so it's not just in high school, but we're talking about much earlier. So if we want those experiences of social inclusion, then we have to find these kinds of meaningful, it makes sense why they were taking those pictures of connectedness when it came to Special Olympics, because that was, for these athletes, a meaningful environment. And now I'm not saying that everybody should go right away and join Special Olympics, because it's for people who want to participate in sport, people who see that and want to be involved in that way. If they have the opportunity to choose that and they make that choice and then they're involved, we see these kinds of gains, these kinds of experiences. I want to share with you another example of context and an alignment between strength and context that's pretty unique. So this is a video that I'm going to share with you now. And so sometimes on Zoom, if we were in person, the video would be fine. It's embedded with the presentation, but over Zoom, sometimes it doesn't work very well. So if it doesn't kind of work well, Laura, you can kind of jump in and I'll skip ahead because I don't want people to kind of have to listen to a fragmented video. So this is a news clip that I want to share with you of a young person with developmental disability.
Well, it is a common sight at high school games across the country. A student dressed up as the mascot working the crowd. But what Nevada's mascot has been able to do is anything but ordinary. Here's tonight's Sunday Sports Extra. On Friday nights, just about the only thing that attracts more attention than the camera guy is the mascot. And the Nevada Cub has the role down pat. They love him. Well, all right, not everybody. He spreads joy all night, but the biggest smile is happening inside the mask. And it belongs to senior Caleb Popejoy.
He's autistic. He has autism. He was antisocial. He had a hard time being in crowds of people.
I think it was when we started middle school. He was terrified just to walk into a big crowd in the gym when school started. A group like this would have scared him.
So you can imagine mom and dad's shock when Caleb had an idea his freshman year.
He seen the mask at the school office and took an interest in it. I kept thinking about other mascots. I dressed up in it.
It was worrisome. We were there right by his side when he first did it because we thought he was gonna be nervous.
Instead,
Coming out here and giving people high fives and giving them hugs.
Like being a mascot has really brought out his social side. It's allowed him to express what he couldn't otherwise when he's behind the mask.
you got the moves down.
Yeah.
No doubt about it. The costume gave Caleb courage here in Nevada. But then a funny thing happened. When he took the costume off, he realized he didn't even need it.
He's gotten used to people now. He can greet people. He can talk to people. He's not afraid of crowds anymore.
I feel excited and happy.
Despite autism's social and emotional challenges, this cub has matured. Tell me how proud you are and how far he's been able to.
Oh, the hard question.
Yeah.
To me, he seems like a new child.
Yeah.
He's not the same kid he was when he started high school.
So I showed that to you because to me, when I saw that kind of video, when I watch it, a number of things come into my mind. This is a young person who had an interest in something, focus. And think about all of the things that had to go right in their context for them to experience what they've talked about here. They probably needed to have, well, first of all, I don't know about where you live, but where I live, nobody really goes to the high school football games, right? That like what you see in these kinds of crowds. In that culture, in that place, that's remember the definition of thriving, that's a valued kind of activity, and it's a valued collective activity for that community. Within that, all of this takes place. So you first have to have that. Within this also, there has to be the opportunity for him to participate, to do this, to get into the mascot costume. That has to align with his interest in doing so. But imagine all of the ways that this could have not happened. You could have had a school person say, no, Caleb, you're not allowed to do that, or no for some other reason. His parents, for sheer nervousness and wanting to protect their son, could have said, we're not comfortable with this right now for you. Or there could have been many other kind of challenges. Maybe he wanted to do it, but the mask was uncomfortable for him, or he couldn't wear the costume, and the list goes on and on. You can think about kind of all the ways that there would be interference there. But also, he's around his peers, and there has to be a degree of acceptance and a degree that's not just tokenistic, but of actually saying what you're doing here matters, Caleb. You're contributing in your own way. You might not be on the field, or you might not be cheerleading with us, but you're doing something here that you're a part of. Right? And then we hear kind of what the parents were talking about and the impact that this has for them too, in seeing their child grow and seeing their child develop. So if we could stack a whole bunch of these experiences into a person's life and boost that, imagine the kind of growth that we could achieve. And so I just alluded to this. It's not just about helping the person, but also about supporting family. And a lot of our research is also at this level. And when we ask people about their experiences, sometimes we get a lot of negative things, rightly so: crisis, unable, challenges, stress, financial, the list goes on and on. But within that, there's also positives, and we have to nurture that and help support them with the negatives, because a healthy family is a key aspect to helping this grow. And I should say that because the health of the individual and the health of the family, the wellness, they interact with each other. So sometimes it's not about working on the person or with the person directly, it's on addressing that family wellness as much as we can. Supporting caregivers before and after mental health problems, for example, is absolutely critical. There's an idea, really, there's 3 parts to what we often ask about, if we were to boil things down in terms of how we support family members and families more broadly, not just family members. But families have certain set capabilities or resources. And there's also many demands and stressors, as you all know so very well. And the real question that we try to ask is, how do we help families maintain a balance between the two? How can the capabilities and resources and coping behaviors that they have balance out all those demands? And as demands pile on more, what kind of resources or capabilities can we leverage? Can we bring in from the family or from outside of the family to balance? Sometimes that's the way that adaptation or family wellness works. Other times we have to ask the question, how can we lessen the demands? Because we can't add any more capabilities or resources. And of course, through this, it's not just about if like a checklist of these two things. The idea behind this model of adaptation is that we find that two people could have the same list of demands and the same list of resources, but they make different meanings out of them. They have different experiences psychologically about that balance. And that really mediates the difference. So it's also the person's wellness. And that's, as a psychologist, what I very much am focused on is the psychological interventions that we can enable for family members to help. So it's almost like that meaning piece rather than actually changing, and maybe coping behaviors too. We know that parents value empowerment, psychological acceptance, being able to focus kind of to cope at the right time and getting help at the right time. And beyond them, respite, social support from the right people. Not all social support is made equal. And positive experiences with systems. And one of the biggest stressors is not actually about having raising a child with an intellectual disability. It's having to go through again and again and again, having negative experiences with systems of care outside of the family. Psychologically speaking, in terms of supports, if people are struggling, if parents want supports for their own wellness, we often say, the old adage, why is it remember when we used to fly on airplanes? Why is it that they often tell you if the masks drop to put the mask on yourself first before putting it on someone else, right? That self-care is caring for others. And we know there's actually many studies that exist now to know that there are brief interventions or programs, that is, for parents and siblings too, fewer for siblings, but they exist also, of people with developmental disabilities, of kids and of adults, that help boost parents' own psychological well-being, what we call acceptance and commitment therapy workshops. Yona Linsky and colleagues at CAMH are running some of these actually right now. We've done research on mindfulness and mindful parenting as an approach that is not changing your actual parenting behaviors, but your experience of how you see yourself as a parent and your emotions and how you relate to those emotions. There's also been research you might not need, even for these programs, we know you don't even need a clinician per se, that there are parent-to-parent support groups that have been shown to, that when parents deliver these kinds of interventions to groups with other parents, they see remarkable changes. Both things like mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is, by the way, commonly, more commonly available now. It's not specific to developmental disabilities, or empowerment supports. We've done comparisons where we've compared mindfulness interventions to like parents who participate in a mindfulness group to parents who participate in another kind of information support group. And there are gains in both, though there are subtle differences where there are more gains with the mindfulness for some parents. But the most important thing is finding a group, finding a support that's right for the person, right? Because there's never going to be one thing that works for everyone. So hopefully that gives you some ideas and makes you passionate as I am about kind of this idea of flourishing and thriving. I want to talk a bit about some of my current labs research and a current study on understanding a best life and where we're going in the future. So right now we have a project that we're just about wrapping up, called Thriving with Intellectual Disability, a photo elicitation study. And this is one that's for teens with intellectual disability. It's an online photo study. And what we've done for this, and I should say, what we did for this study is that we had two adults with intellectual disability who are paid as part of our team to advise what we're doing. Two Canadians, and they kind of helped us design all the graphics and our processes and the language and the ideas behind this, and we kind of work with them to help us with what we're doing here. So we're really grateful for that. So what we do here is we were going to have people go out and take pictures, but we decided to do this during COVID. And so instead, there's a few questionnaires, and then what we do is we have we ask teens and their parents to go through their photos that they already have done and pick 10 photos of what thriving means to the teen. So we ask the teen to do this, and if they want their parents' help, their parents can help them pick those 10 photos. And then we kind of adapt the questions depending on how much language a person has and how comfortable they are using language over Zoom, where we actually kind of go through those photos and we ask a few questions to understand a bit more about it. So this is a qualitative study, so we don't need large numbers. So we've had 11 teens, and it's still open to a few more. So if anybody here is interested, you can let us know afterwards. But these were kind of across Ontario, Manitoba, and Alberta so far in terms of participants, and many different, as you can see here, people with global developmental delays or cerebral palsy, autism, Down syndrome, Cornelia de Lange, as some examples of diagnoses of people. And what are some of the themes? Well, they seem to be landing on many of those C's. You know, here's one that a 15-year-old kind of commented. This is me and a little baby goat. I actually love babies and animals and little baby children. I just love being around babies. Even when I eventually calmed down from my excitement, the baby goat calmed down in my arms. I felt good holding that baby. He didn't even know how to walk yet, right? And I should say that when we do this study, we ask people, we want to pick pictures of your best life, of your best self. And we talk a little bit about what that is, but we don't know what kind of content they're going to give us, right? That can mean anything to anyone. Another teen said, I was building a fence with my dad. It took about a week to get the fence up. It was a lot of work. I like how I put the fence. The picture reminds me of working with my dad. I wanted to help so I could learn how to make things and learn how to make houses. I'm really proud that I finished it. So in asking, you know, about one's best self, these are some of the ideas of like the pictures that teens are picking. So you can imagine when we have 10 pictures for each teen and we bring those together, what kind of story we can share, right? These are some that some of the moms who were involved kind of talked about in looking at those photos, right? So we ask parents to think about their own reflections. The more confident she is, the more opportunities she has. Self-efficacy is huge. If she's confident in every area of her life, then she'll be able to advocate for herself in every area of her life. Or there were times when he just didn't want to go to school. There were times he was frustrated with learning, and we always just kind of pushed forward. And I think the fact that we took this day, which was a grade 8 graduation photo, to mark this milestone for him, well, he looks back at this photo and thinks, wow, I did it, right? So you can imagine the themes that are emerging from these kind of photos. And this leads me to my last kind of point, is I said, you know, when I'm working with people, how do I even figure out where to start if I want to map out some of the activities we could do together? Well, folks, colleagues from a group called CanChild from McMaster University came out with the idea of the 5 F's, or the F words. So fitness, family, friends, function, and fun. I thought there was another one, but maybe I'm wrong. So here's some examples of things, of advice that people often give around these. But the idea that is like taking care of yourself and others in the family, right? Fitness, how, you know, engaging in good health. Friends or function, right? Having day schedules that work for you and so on. The idea that when I work with somebody clinically is I often kind of explore with them, what do they do already in their life that contributes to each one of these F's? And you know, over time, when we learn and we think about it, there's actually a lot of these F's, of activities that are good examples of these F's in our lives already. And then I ask, what's one more F? What's one more activity that you can add to your F's this week or today? It doesn't have to be a huge thing. But when we add one more today and one more in a few days from now and one more next week, we start to compile a greater amount of these kind of activities in our arsenal. And then we have a greater menu essentially to pull from and a greater experience of these. And you can imagine how all of these F words connect with those C's, right? They kind of reflect on what we can do. So I use this therapeutically a lot, and it I think helps a person move towards that degree of all those experiences I talked about. Some future research that we're doing. So I've talked a lot. I started off talking about kind of negative aspects of mental health, and then I shifted and talked about positive aspects. And where we're moving with this work is actually combining the two. What a number of people talk about when they talk about mental health is that it's not all on one dimension. That is, we don't just go from like negative mental health to positive mental health, right? That people can experience this dimension of flourishing. That is, some people have high levels of flourishing and other people have very low levels of flourishing. That is what they call languishing, and on one dimension, and other ones is like a mental health problems dimension. So that is, I know people who for many have many of those C's, but they also have high levels of anxiety. Does that mean they don't experience the C's? No, it means that they live with, they're thriving with anxiety, right? Other people might not have high levels of anxiety, but they're low on the C's. Other people might have a combination, right, of them. Ideally, we would like everybody to have high C's and low levels of mental health problems. That sounds fantastic for everybody. But for some people, we might need to target one dimension and other people the second dimension. So this is what we call a dual continuum model. That's it, a dual continuum model of how we want to kind of push people in different directions. So what we're doing is we're actually embarking on a study to identify how can we measure this in people with intellectual disability, in teens. Can we come up with a better way of doing this using surveys? Because if we can measure this, we can target it. And if we can target it, we can change it. And if we can change it, we can help. So ultimately, kind of in conclusion to what I've been talking about today, this is really about a fit between the individual and their contexts. And I don't know if people remember the book, The Missing Piece. So the missing piece, there's a part where it says in the book, the missing piece sat alone waiting for someone to come along and take it somewhere. And in my work so far, I was often very much focused on like interventions for the person, like cognitive behavior therapy. And that's really important. But there is a piece missing. You know, other people are very interested in, and it's important to do social work and to address environments, and that's important too. But ultimately, you know, there's a piece missing until we can kind of create that whole. I want to leave you with this picture here. I know we're at 8 o'clock now, but I want to leave you with this picture and one last story. I was working in a school and I walked by that school, and you can see here a photo of sticks that have been built up into this kind of picture, into this building here, this structure. And these aren't even glued together. These are kind of balanced. And this was a young man, a young autistic man who, you know, in elementary school, that is, who built this. And to me, this is a good example of thriving, because it required a teacher who noticed that he had this interest. It required a student with skills and strengths in a certain visual spatial areas. It also required peers to respect this and to prize it in the classroom. This is up all year. Nobody's messing with this. And you could imagine in a rambunctious school, a classroom, how easy it would be for a student to go over and pull a piece out or bump into it accidentally. Yet it stands without gates around it as a valued contribution to the classroom. And every time that student goes into that classroom, they see what they've done, and other students see what they've done, right? To me, this is a message of thriving. And this is what I hope for everybody. So thank you so much for kind of listening and for staying on. I know we kind of went to the end here. I'm happy. I don't know if there is time for questions, but thank you again for the invitation. And I hope there's a bit of a kernel here for everyone, or for people.
Okay, thank you so much, Jonathan, for giving us that dissertation. You know, it's very interesting, and I think certainly for me, you know, as a parent of an individual with Down syndrome, the reflection on some of those things that we just haven't really quantified or defined. So again, I just think that was a wonderful way to bring it all together and to have people consider some of those different aspects of moving away from a negative deficit model to something that's more exciting. When we sometimes I find, you know, somebody's being introduced, you know, hello, this is Kevin, he has Down syndrome. You know, well, I wouldn't do that with my other children and say, hello, this is Susan, she has itchy feet or something. You know, I would introduce her with one of her attributes. And even something as simple as that, introducing your child with an attribute goes a long way in setting the stage for what conversation comes afterwards. So thank you. Let's see what's in the chat. So accolades, no particular questions in general. I think there is an opportunity to ask questions if you like, or to pose questions. We will make the presentation available, the recording available with the recordings of the other presentations this week, early next week. So you may be able to share them with your peers or colleagues if you're in a working environment. And on behalf of CDSS, again, I would just really like to thank you for taking the time and explaining to us some of your past experience, your current experience, and also your hope for the future, and making a difference, having impact, and allowing people with intellectual disabilities to thrive and have the best life.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. And it sounds like hopefully a number of this, people know this to be true in their hearts. And so if I can help put some words to some language to what we fundamentally know here, and we can move it forward, that's something we can do in partnership. If I'll just end by saying, if people want to get involved in our research and some of these projects and have a contribution in them, feel free to reach out to me. You know, I'm sure, Laura, you can provide people with my contact information. And there was some contact information from a student of mine in those last few slides, because we can work together and kind of grow this kind of work.
Excellent. You know, just a little bit of a heads up. I know that we haven't set a date yet for a meeting, but CDSS is going to take some leadership in bringing some of these researchers together to see what's out there, what some of the gaps are in some of the studies that are being done. And we know more and more as people want answers about what to do right or what to do the best. There has to be research ahead in order to be able to address that. And it's to encourage people as much as they possibly can to help us to build a database of information that good things can be built on. So stay tuned for news of our research leadership, and also connecting individuals, parents, families, support workers with some of the other libraries of research about individuals with Down syndrome that is now starting to take place, particularly in Europe and in the United States. So thank you again, Dr. Weiss, for contributing to that library of research, and looking forward and helping all of us to make sure our loved ones with Down syndrome live the best life. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura.